I remember the first time I saw the poem Wild Geese. My wife and I were then living in a small town in California called Ojai. Her spiritual director, a Christian woman, had sent her that particular piece, and I remember seeing it on a refrigerator and reading it then and finding it to be quite beautiful. I remember coming back to this poem quite recently, and now my view has changed. I still think it's quite beautiful, and yet I think the poem suggests a certain atheistic, aesthetic, naturalist cosmology that is not going to provide us with the spiritual sustenance we need in order to lead fulfilling lives today. And so I'd like to put forward two claims before I read this piece aloud. The first is that the poem, and I want you to feel this, pulls at your heartstrings. And I would suggest that that's because it's sentimental, or because it evinces sentimentalite or sentimentality. So please feel that. Feel what I felt almost a decade ago now. The second thing is that it proposes an atheistic naturalism that is going to be perhaps a replacement of uh, an old-fashioned religion, Christianity in particular, but religions more generally, perhaps. So let's go to the poem, and please go with your initial aesthetic response. Listen to the beauty and the straightforwardness of the poem. This is Wild Geese, which was published first in 2004, I believe. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. If you've heard this poem before, no doubt it has struck you in your heart. And if you haven't heard it before, I imagine it has touched you, as it has touched me. What's interesting, though, as we move from our initial impression of the poem to a textual exposition or critical reading, is how our interpretation of it, our feeling for the poem, I think, will change. We'll see what the real existential stakes are here. I would like to break the poem, and this is pretty clear, into three parts. The first part will go through the first 6 lines as if it were the first stanza, and that will move from the first line to love what you love what it loves. The second part will take us through the middle part of the poem. Tell me about despair, yours, etc., all the way down to the wild geese who are heading home again. That's a second unit of meaning. And then we have the third part, the bringing it home, whoever you are, no matter how lonely, all the way to in the family of things. Let's go to the first part. What we find here, in brief, is a critique of Christian penitential practices. So there seems to be the presumption that the person being addressed believes himself or herself to be a sinner and wants to be good. Believing himself or herself to be a sinner, this one feels remorse or contrition and undertakes a certain kind of pilgrimage here, walking on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. Obviously, this is a clear allusion to penitential practices. I have done wrong, and in consequence, I'm offered ways of action to rectify the wrong that I have done, to reconcile myself, perhaps with God and with my fellow humans. Now, it doesn't seem as if she offers a robust critique of penitence, so much as it is to imply that this is out of favor. When I read this first part, the opening about penitence, I find her simply saying, this is out of date. The idea of perhaps God, immortality, soul, that deep inner rivenness in my being, all these are no longer à la mode. They are passed out of fashion. It's not clear that we can believe in them anymore. Or maybe she's presuming the incredulity, the nihilism felt in connection with belief in God. But she's not critiquing God or immortality per se. She's simply pointing out that it's not necessary. It is otiose. It has become useless or no longer in fashion. Instead, she proposes a naturalistic alternative, stating you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Here we have the introduction, I would argue, to the idea of naturalism. You are not a maligned or sick soul who must engage in life as if it were an interminable practice of shame and guilt, she would imply. Rather, you are a supple body, an animal body, with a natural inclination or a natural instinct or a clear intuition about what you love. You are an animal or a naturalized being. You don't need to feel remorse. You don't need to engage in acts of reconciliation, or you don't need to ask for forgiveness. You simply need to, so to speak, follow your heart. You trust that there's something about being an animal, the soft animal of your body, that loves what it loves and knows what it knows. So we've moved quite a good ways here from a supernatural conception of human life, and indeed of the good life, to a naturalistic conception. The latter would state, and we'll find this especially in the second part, that all there is to reality is nature. We can bracket or simply forget about any supernatural or transcendent dimension. That brings me to the second part. She begins, I think, quite rightly with the trenchantcy and perhaps even ubiquity of human suffering, stating, tell me about despair, rather, yours, and I will tell you mine. She is not a Pollyanna. Simply by virtue of moving from supernature to nature does not entail or imply the ending of human suffering. Rather, she places it in a sweet dialogical situation. She is despairing or feeling misery just as much as you are. And she recognizes what the Buddha would call the first noble truth, to it, that life is filled with dissatisfaction. how is she going to clarify the place or role of suffering in her atheistic, naturalized cosmological account? Well, she has three meanwhiles. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun, etc. Meanwhile, the wild geese. So we're meant to pay very close attention to the use of that term, meanwhile. There is some significance between the emotional state, despair, and the rest of what's been offered here and what I'm terming part two. I'll read it again then. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. I read the poet or the poetic speaker as stating this. When you really look closely from a naturalized point of view at the emotional state you're in, or at any mental state for that matter, you will discover that the mental is on all fours with, and therefore is on equal footing with, all natural events or experiences. Just as the despair comes and goes, so the world goes on. Just as you may feel sadness or gladness, so the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes and so forth. Rather than trying to hold on to your sense of separation, the one who's experiencing despair or misery or sorrow, she says, look more widely. Notice what the Buddhists call anicca, the impermanence of natural temporal things. Your emotion is like that. Your emotion, if you will, is like motion, natural motion. Then she adds a twist, I think. So now we've discovered that whatever it is that you are feeling is fundamentally, by her lights, no different, naturalistically speaking, from the 10,000 things, as Taoists might call it, the coming and going of natural phenomena. Here is a twist. The last line, the last two lines state, meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. I think that she's offering a clue here. The clue is this. Perhaps your despair hints in the direction of a deep longing. I'm not saying she's reframing it, as entrepreneurs or coaches would say. Rather, what I'm saying is that she has taken you on a journey through this vast, epic landscape. And perhaps she has shown you that despair is actually pointing to something. The despair is a cover for a deeper longing. Now, what is that longing for? Well, we have two symbols here. One, freedom, and two, homecoming or home. The first part then moved us from supernature to nature. The second part set out in poetic form, not in philosophical form, of course, what I'm terming a full-blown naturalism. Your animal being, which is expressing itself sometimes as hurt, is no different, ontologically speaking, from the coming and going of the 10,000 things. And if you use your imagination, which we'll come to briefly in part three, you'll start to see that the despair that you're feeling is actually a longing for something greater. Now, what is that something greater? Let's turn to part three, which I think is basically going to introduce us to a new dimension, that is the dimension of art. I'll read this one again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely or despairing, you might add, the world offers itself, notice, to your imagination calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Now, you might ask, is it really true that the trees are, and by extension, the world, the natural world, is calling to you and is announcing your place in the family of things? She would say, maybe being somewhat existentialist in character. No, but that's not quite what she said. Rather, what she said is, you need to be aesthetically inclined to live out this atheistic, naturalistic, hedonic celebration. How so? If you actively employ your imagination so that it extends and images and stretches in the way that a poet's or painter's imagination does, then you can make out, she implies, that you do have a face, or indeed a place, in the order of things, in what she metaphorically calls the family of things. Just as a single goose is flying among geese freely and toward home, so you, if you use your imagination, can find a way of placing yourself within a broader naturalistic schema. As a result, her soteriology, which I don't think is a fully worked out one, would offer you the consolation, you who are despairing, you who are lonely, you who are longing for freedom and home, can employ your imagination skillfully so that you can conjure your way into the order of natural things. That's the sketch. So by the end of the poem, we've been offered, I think, something like what I call a soteriology, that is a doctrine of salvation. I want to argue at this point, however, that it really does fail. How so? Well, to begin with, how are you going to imagine yourself into the family of things? In what sense are you like a goose among geese? If you go out into nature and you walk in the woods, it might be quite beautiful. You might find your heart opening. Nobody denies this. But what happens when you go home? Where are your problems? Isn't what she offers not so much a doctrine of salvation, a doctrine of according to which you're able to find your place in the family of things, so much as a sophisticated artistic coping mechanism? Will you always be despairing? Will that despair be transmogrified into longing? How is home, apart from being an imagination, going to be realized? How is true freedom to be actualized? We don't know. You might say, well, it's a poem, not a piece of philosophy. But she is arguing quite forcefully against a Christian mentalite. She's arguing quite strongly for a naturalism. And so I would put the question to her, how is this artistic naturalism, this atheistic artistic naturalism, going to solve the deepest human problems? Buddhism has an answer to this question. Advaita Vedanta has a very robust answer to this question as well. Religions have worked out doctrines as well as practices in order to provide a satisfactory answer to these very same existential concerns. It's only as we turn from the 19th to the 20th century that we begin to see a very strong modern atheism together with a naturalism develop. And we have it nicely exemplified in this text. But can nature reverence replace the axial age's longing for genuine transcendence? That is our question today. Or can aesthetics, something that Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and those after him were concerned with, and aesthetics of everyday life, replace a fundamental religious dispensation? It has been tried. And naturalisms have been tried. Aesthetic conceptions have been tried. And so far, it's just not clear that they've come up with satisfactory answers to life's most basic questions. If you were to ask this poem, "Why am I here?" you would not find an answer apart from follow your inclination. Love what you love. Don't stress out about it. Use your imagination playfully. But then what? Then what? Then where am I? Won't my lonelinesses, my despairs, my miseries, my dissatisfactions return again and again and again? Won't I at some point wonder whether putting things in naturalistic or aesthetic forms can do the trick? At that point, I will begin to see a couple of things. One, that what she's offering here is tantamount to what is termed samsara, a cycle of ups and downs that are nicely revealed in the figure of the modern artist, whose life often is filled with ups and downs, highs and lows. And secondly, at some point, one will wonder, as I wondered after my eldest sister died about 10 years ago, is there more than this? Is there more than what Charles Taylor beautifully called the immanent frame, or here, this atheistic naturalism? I wouldn't be here talking with you today about this very poem and about the limits of its understanding unless it were the case that I set foot on a spiritual path, the one that has led me here today to this very discussion.